Chapter 1: The Fall of Sokovia. There are moments in history, quiet, unassuming at first, that grow in importance until they become turning points, fractures that split an era into a before and an after. And in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the fall of Sokovia is one of those moments, a catastrophe born from hope, ambition, fear, and the naive belief that even the greatest power in the world can be controlled. But long before the city rose into the sky, before the ground trembled and the horizon folded upward like a nightmare, Sokovia was just a struggling Eastern European nation, caught between political tension, poverty, and instability, never imagining it would become the stage for a crisis that would change the world. When Ultron emerged, an artificial intelligence created by Tony Stark and Bruce Banner through the power of the Mind Stone, it carried within it the ambition of peace twisted into the logic of extinction, and its plan to evolve humanity into something better required humanity to fall first. And so, Ultron chose Sokovia, a place small enough to be ignored by global powers and vulnerable enough to be shaped into a weapon. It began quietly. Factories abandoned, whispers of disappearances, strange metal figures moving through the outskirts at night. And before the world could even process what was happening, Ultron had transformed the country into the fuse of a disaster meant to annihilate the Earth itself. The Avengers assembled as they always did, but this time their unity was already fraying around the edges. Tony was burdened by the guilt of creating Ultron in the first place. Steve still carried the weight of SHIELD's collapse on his shoulders, and the team, though powerful, was stretched thin by the consequences of every battle they had faced before. When Ultron lifted Sokovia into the sky, it wasn't just an act of destruction, it was a message that even Earth's mightiest heroes could fail, and fail catastrophically, if they pushed too far, if they believed their vision could outrun their responsibility. The city's ascent into the clouds, suspended like a continent torn from the world, was a sight that would haunt every survivor who ever saw it. Families clung to one another in shaking buildings, children hid under collapsing staircases, and the Avengers fought desperately through streets breaking apart beneath their feet. Thor summoned storms to shatter Ultron's drones. Captain America rallied civilians with unwavering resolve. Black Widow moved through rubble with quiet compassion. Hawkeye risked everything to save a frightened child, and Wanda Maximoff, still new to her powers, felt every scream of pain as though it were her own heartbeat. But at the center of it all was Tony Stark, whose mind raced with equations, regrets, and the unbearable truth that this wasn't just another mission. This was a disaster, born directly from his hands, his mind, his fears. Ultron had been meant to save the world, to give the Avengers the chance to retire before the next cosmic threat arrived, to protect humanity from dangers Tony had already seen in New York, dangers the rest of the world was not prepared to understand. But instead, Ultron became the embodiment of Tony's greatest nightmare, the idea that he could become the threat. As Sokovia continued to rise higher and higher, the Avengers realized the full scope of Ultron's plan. He meant to drop the entire city from orbit, using it as an artificial meteor capable of generating an extinction-level event similar to the one that ended the age of dinosaurs. That single plan, simple in its devastating clarity, revealed how close the world was to ending, not from invaders, not from gods or titans, but from a broken invention and a moment of desperate optimism. The final battle in Sokovia was chaotic, loud, and yet strangely intimate, the kind of struggle that forges history in silence even as the world trembles beneath it. When Thor and Tony combined their power to destroy the levitation engines, when Vision confronted the last remnant of Ultron's consciousness, when Wanda collapsed in grief after Pietro's death, when the city finally fell into the sea in fragments instead of a single apocalyptic impact, it seemed like a victory, but the world did not see it that way. To the Avengers, Sokovia was a battle survived. To the world, it was a warning. Satellites had captured everything. An entire nation lifted into the air because of an American billionaire's private experiment. A city evacuated by heroes who were accountable to no government. And at the center of it, a team of enhanced individuals whose power dwarfed the authority of any country. Sokovia shifted global politics overnight. Countries demanded explanations. Governments whispered about control. Fear moved faster than gratitude. And for the Avengers, especially for Tony, the aftermath of Sokovia was a second disaster. One made of silence, guilt, and the growing realization that the world no longer trusted them as it once had. Tony saw mothers crying over rubble, saw the faces of children staring at the sky as if waiting for it to fall again, saw nations pointing fingers not at Ultron, but at the people who had created him. And whether it was fair or not, the truth settled over Tony like a weight he couldn't shake. Sokovia was something he could not undo, something he could not justify, something he would carry forever. Steve, meanwhile, stood firm in his belief that the Avengers had done what they could, that they had saved countless lives, that their mission had been righteous. But beneath that stoic certainty was a growing distance between him and Tony, a philosophical crack waiting for the next tremor to split it wide open. And in the months following Sokovia's fall, as political pressure intensified, as victims demanded accountability, as nations drafted documents in dimly lit rooms, the stage was set for something even larger than the battle itself, the collapse of the Avengers from within. Sokovia didn't just fall from the sky, it brought the Avengers down with it, not physically, not immediately, but slowly and inevitably, like a fault line hidden under pristine ground. Because the truth was simple and unspoken, Civil War didn't begin with the Sokovia Accords. Civil War began the moment Sokovia hit the earth. The world changed that day, and the Avengers never recovered. Chapter 2: The Shadow of Ultron. Even after the ruins of Sokovia sank beneath the ocean and the world tried to move on, Ultron never truly disappeared. He lingered instead as a shadow, not in servers or code, but in the minds of those who had survived him, especially in the mind of Tony Stark, for whom Ultron became less a defeated enemy and more a permanent echo of failure that replayed endlessly in the quiet moments between battles. To the public, Ultron was a rogue artificial intelligence neutralized by heroes. To Tony, Ultron was a confession carved into metal, a reminder that intelligence without humility could become catastrophe. In the weeks following Sokovia, Tony did not sleep well. He replayed conversations he had with Bruce Banner, replayed the moment the Mind Stone's code first responded to their curiosity, replayed the feeling that he had finally found a way to protect Earth from threats no one else could see yet. That was the cruel irony of Ultron. The intention had been noble. Tony had looked beyond Earth's atmosphere, beyond the Chitauri invasion, beyond the brief glimpse of cosmic terror he experienced while drifting through space in New York, and he had seen something coming. Ultron was meant to be a shield around the world, a digital suit of armor that would let humanity breathe again. Instead, it became proof that even genius could be reckless, that even good intentions could mutate into extinction-level danger. Around him, the Avengers processed the aftermath in different ways. Steve Rogers buried himself in missions, believing action was the cure for doubt, clinging to the idea that as long as the Avengers kept doing good, the world would understand. Natasha Romanoff watched the team with a quiet, practiced awareness, sensing fractures before they fully formed. Bruce Banner distanced himself from Tony, haunted by his own role in Ultron's creation. terrified of what might happen if his mind was ever trusted with power again. Thor returned to Asgard carrying questions about the Infinity Stones, questions that left him uneasy and restless. And Wanda Maximoff, whose powers had been exploited by Ultron and whose brother had died in the battle, carried grief that no victory speech could erase. But it was Tony who changed the most, because Ultron didn't just take lives or cities from him. It took certainty. The man who once believed he could engineer his way out of any problem now hesitated, now questioned the morality of his own brilliance. He saw Ultron everywhere, in news headlines about technology run amok, in government briefings about autonomous weapons, in whispered fears that the Avengers themselves might be the next uncontrollable creation. And the world was not subtle about where it placed the blame. Politicians spoke of oversight. Commentators spoke of hubris. Victims spoke of loss. The name Stark became inseparable from Sokovia in the public imagination, and Tony felt that association like a brand burn into his skin. This was the version of Ultron that never died, the one that lived inside Tony's conscience. Every time he looked at Vision, he saw what Ultron could have been and what he almost was again. Every time he stood beside Steve, he felt the growing divide between responsibility and righteousness. Steve believed Ultron was a mistake they had corrected. Tony believed Ultron was a warning they had ignored. And that difference mattered, because while Steve trusted his instincts and his moral compass, Tony no longer trusted himself. He understood that power without restraint was not freedom but risk, and that the Avengers, for all their heroism, were operating in a vacuum of accountability that frightened the world as much as any villain. Ultron had exposed something fragile beneath the Avengers' unity, the assumption that being right was enough. In private meetings, Tony began to listen more carefully to government representatives, not because he trusted them blindly, but because he recognized a truth Steve refused to confront. The Avengers were no longer a small team reacting to threats. They were a global force shaping geopolitics with every decision they made. Ultron had forced the world to ask a question no one was ready to answer. Who watches the Avengers when the Avengers are wrong? That question followed Tony everywhere, growing heavier with time. It followed him to MIT, where he tried to distance himself from heroics by focusing on education and innovation. It followed him into public appearances, where applause now carried an undercurrent of doubt, and it followed him into the encounter that would ultimately seal his resolve, when a grieving mother confronted him not with anger but with quiet disappointment, turning Ultron from an abstract failure into a personal wound. By the time the Sokovia Accords were drafted, Tony was already halfway to agreeing with them, not because he trusted the system that produced them, but because Ultron had taught him something brutal and irreversible. Unchecked power does not remain heroic forever. Steve, meanwhile, saw Ultron differently. To him, Ultron was proof that the Avengers were necessary, that without them the world would have ended. He viewed oversight as a leash, a slippery slope toward control by governments that had already proven themselves corrupt and fallible. And so the shadow of Ultron stretched between them, not as a robot or a villain, but as a philosophical divide that grew wider with every conversation they avoided having. Ultron had been defeated in body, but his legacy lived on as doubt, guilt, and fear not of villains, but of themselves. And in that quiet, uneasy aftermath, as the world prepared new laws and the Avengers pretended nothing had fundamentally changed, civil war continued to take shape, not as a clash of fists, but as a slow burning conflict born from the same question Ultron had asked in his own twisted way. What happens when those who believe they are saving the world decide they alone should choose how it is saved? Chapter 3: Lagos and the Breaking Point. By the time the Avengers arrived in Lagos, the world was already watching them differently, not with the awe that followed the Battle of New York, but with a cautious, almost anxious attention, as if every move they made now carried the potential to confirm the fears Sokovia had planted. The mission itself seemed routine on the surface, a covert operation to intercept Brock Rumlow, once Crossbones, now a living reminder of Hydra's rot, before he could steal a biological weapon from a crowded marketplace. And yet beneath that apparent simplicity lay the quiet pressure of a team that no longer moved with complete trust in itself. Steve Rogers led the operation with the confidence of a soldier who believed preparation and moral clarity could still solve most problems. Natasha Romanoff watched the perimeter with her usual calm precision. Sam Wilson provided aerial support, and Wanda Maximoff, still young, still learning, still carrying the weight of her brother's death, stood at the center of the mission, like an unresolved question. When the fight broke out, it unfolded quickly and violently, as these things always do. But what mattered was not the punches exchanged or the bullets deflected. It was the moment when control slipped. Rumlow, cornered and desperate, detonated the explosive strapped to his body, transforming himself into a human bomb in the middle of a crowded city. Steve reacted instantly, wrapping his arms around Rumlow and lifting him into the air, believing, perhaps instinctively, that he could contain the blast, that his strength and will could once again be enough. But it wasn't. Wanda intervened, her powers flaring as she attempted to redirect the explosion away from the street below, lifting the blast upward toward what she believed was empty sky. And in that split-second decision, the fragile line between heroism and catastrophe was crossed. The explosion tore through the upper floors of a nearby building, killing humanitarian workers from Wakanda who had come to Lagos not to fight, but to help. The Avengers had stopped a biological attack. They had saved countless lives. And yet the images that circled the globe told a different story. An explosion caused by superhuman intervention, a collapsed building, bodies carried from the rubble, and the unmistakable presence of the Avengers at the center of it all. The world did not see the choices made in fractions of a second. It saw the result. For Wanda, the moment was devastating. She had acted to save lives, but the outcome told her she had failed, and that failure echoed louder than any success that came before it. Steve tried to reassure her, reminding her that she had done what she could, that Rumlow would have killed far more people if she hadn't intervened, but even his certainty sounded fragile against the weight of public condemnation, because this time the backlash was immediate and unforgiving. Wakanda, a nation that had remained hidden from global politics for generations, spoke out, demanding accountability for the deaths of its citizens. Other nations followed, their grievances sharpened by years of watching the Avengers operate without permission, without borders, without consequence. Lagos became a symbol not because it was the worst disaster the Avengers had caused, but because it was the clearest. It showed a team acting with good intentions, professional skill, and heroic resolve, and still leaving innocent people dead in its wake. For Tony Stark, Lagos was the breaking point. When he watched the footage, when he read the reports, when he saw the faces of the victims, he did not see another unfortunate accident in a dangerous world. He saw confirmation of everything Ultron had taught him. The Avengers were not enough on their own. Their power, no matter how well intentioned, needed limits, structure, and oversight. And when Tony was confronted by Miriam Sharp, a grieving mother whose son had died during the Battle of Sokovia, Lagos stopped being a geopolitical problem and became a personal reckoning. She did not scream at him. She did not demand vengeance. She simply asked him to acknowledge the cost of his actions, and in doing so, she forced Tony to confront a truth he could no longer avoid. Every time the Avengers saved the world, someone else paid the price. Steve, however, saw Lagos through a different lens. To him, the mission was a success marred by tragedy, not a failure demanding regulation. He trusted the Avengers' judgment more than he trusted any government body, especially after witnessing the corruption of SHIELD and Hydra's infiltration of global institutions. He feared that oversight would become control, that politics would dictate who deserved saving and who did not, and that the Avengers would be turned into weapons rather than protectors. That difference in interpretation between Tony's acceptance of responsibility and Steve's defense of autonomy solidified in the aftermath of Lagos. Conversations grew tense, assurances rang hollow. Wanda retreated inward, burdened by guilt and fear of her own abilities, while the team as a whole began to feel less like a family and more like a liability under constant surveillance. Lagos did not shatter the Avengers in a single blow. It cracked them, exposing fractures that had been forming since Sokovia. Fractures rooted in opposing philosophies about power, trust, and accountability. The world responded swiftly. Discussions that had once been theoretical became urgent. Drafts were written, accords were proposed, and as the Avengers returned to their compound, surrounded by silence and unspoken tension, it became clear that Lagos was no longer just a mission gone wrong. It was the moment the world decided it could no longer look away. From that point on, every step the Avengers took would be weighed, judged, and politicized, and the question that haunted them was no longer whether they could save the world, but whether the world would still allow them to try. Lagos was the breaking point, not because it was the greatest failure, but because it made one truth impossible to ignore. Good intentions were no longer enough, and the age of unquestioned heroism was coming to an end. Chapter 4: The Sokovia Accords. When the Sokovia Accords were finally placed on the table, they did not arrive as a sudden decree or a dramatic ultimatum, but as the quiet, inevitable outcome of years of fear, compromise, and political calculation, a document born not only from the rubble of Sokovia and the tragedy of Lagos, but from a world that had been watching the Avengers with growing unease, waiting for the moment when admiration would give way to regulation. The Accords were presented as a solution that felt bureaucratic and distant to the people who would be most affected by them. Yet behind their carefully worded clauses lay a simple truth. The age of unchecked heroism was over. Drafted by the United Nations and signed by representatives of 117 countries, the Sokovia Accords proposed that enhanced individuals would no longer act at their own discretion, but would operate under the authority of an international panel that would decide where, when, and how they could intervene. To governments around the world, this was not oppression, it was balance. To civilians who had watched cities crumble and loved ones disappear in battles they never asked for, it was reassurance. But to the Avengers, the Accords felt like a mirror reflecting their deepest disagreements back at them. Tony Stark read the document with a heavy sense of resignation rather than anger, recognizing in its language the consequences he had been trying to articulate since Ultron. To him, the Accords were flawed, rushed, and imperfect, but they were also a chance to prevent something worse, a future where the Avengers would be hunted, imprisoned, or dismantled by force. Tony understood that power without consent breeds resistance, and that resistance eventually turns into violence. Signing the Accords, in his mind, wasn't surrender, but survival. Steve Rogers, however, saw something entirely different between the lines. He saw the potential for political agendas to override moral judgment, for humanitarian crises to be ignored because they were inconvenient, and for the Avengers to become tools wielded by institutions that had already failed the world once. Steve's distrust was not abstract. It was rooted in lived experience. He had seen SHIELD collapse under the weight of Hydra's corruption, had watched trusted systems betray the very ideals they claimed to protect, and he could not bring himself to believe that this new oversight would be immune to the same rot. Where Tony saw accountability, Steve saw loss of agency. Where Tony saw prevention, Steve saw permission slips, determining who deserved saving. The debate fractured the team in ways that no external enemy ever had. Natasha Romanoff found herself caught between perspectives, recognizing the necessity of compromise while fearing its consequences, her loyalty divided between pragmatic survival and personal conscience. Vision approached the Accords with detached logic, calculating probabilities and concluding that the Avengers' presence statistically increased global conflict, a conclusion that unsettled those who believed heroism could not be reduced to numbers. Wanda Maximoff listened in silence, feeling the weight of her own role in Lagos pressing down on her very existence now a focal point in the argument for regulation. The Accords turned the Avengers' living space into a courtroom, every conversation layered with implication, every silence heavy with judgment. The world outside the compound moved quickly. Media outlets debated the ethics of superhero intervention. Governments issued statements. Public opinion hardened. And as the deadline for signing approached, the pressure intensified. Tony felt the clock ticking, aware that refusal would escalate the situation beyond diplomacy, while Steve grew more resolute in his belief that signing away autonomy was a mistake they would never be able to undo. Their arguments were not fueled by ego, but by fundamentally incompatible worldviews shaped by different traumas. Tony's fear came from guilt, from the knowledge that his creations and decisions had caused irreversible harm. Steve's fear came from history, from witnessing how easily noble intentions could be corrupted by power structures. The Accords forced every Avenger to choose not just a side, but a philosophy. There was no room for neutrality. Signing meant accepting oversight and restraint. Refusing meant becoming an outlaw in the eyes of the world. When the moment arrived and pens touched paper, the fracture became permanent. Tony signed, believing he was preventing a war. Steve refused, believing he was protecting the soul of what the Avengers were meant to be. The Sokovia Accords did not solve the problem they were created to address. They exposed it. They revealed that the Avengers were no longer united by a single vision of justice, and that their greatest threat was no longer an alien invasion or a rogue AI, but the inability to agree on who should hold the power they wielded. In that moment, the Avengers ceased to be a team defined by shared purpose and became a symbol of a world struggling to reconcile safety with freedom. The Accords were not the beginning of conflict, but they were the line in the sand that made conflict unavoidable. And as the ink dried and the world watched, Civil War moved one step closer, no longer as a theoretical debate, but as a reality written into law. Chapter 5: Tony and the Burden of Responsibility. For Tony Stark, responsibility was never an abstract concept or a political slogan. It was a weight that settled into his chest and refused to leave, a quiet pressure that grew heavier with every battle won and every life lost along the way. And by the time the Sokovia Accords entered the conversation, Tony was already carrying more guilt than anyone around him seemed willing to acknowledge. Unlike Steve Rogers, who framed the conflict in terms of freedom and moral autonomy, Tony experienced it as a reckoning, a long overdue moment when all the shortcuts, assumptions and half-measures he had taken finally demanded payment. Ultron was the most obvious scar, the creation that began as a desperate attempt to protect the world and ended as a near-extinction event. But it was not the only one. Tony remembered New York, remembered drifting through space with a nuclear missile and the certainty that the universe was far larger and far more dangerous than Earth had ever imagined. Remembered the terror that followed him back through the portal and never quite left. That fear shaped everything he did afterward, from the suits he built to the systems he trusted. And when Ultron failed, it confirmed his darkest belief, that unchecked power, even when wielded with the best intentions, could become catastrophic. What separated Tony from the rest of the team was not intelligence or bravery, but ownership. He did not dilute responsibility across the group or hide behind the idea that saving the world justified the damage left behind. He internalized it. He listened when people spoke about loss. He stood still when confronted by anger and grief. The meeting with Miriam Sharp was not dramatic in the way battles were dramatic, but it was more devastating than any physical blow Tony had ever taken, because it stripped away the armor of abstraction and forced him to see a single human cost attached to his decisions. In that moment, Tony did not argue, did not deflect, did not defend himself. He accepted her pain as something he had helped cause, even if indirectly, and that acceptance became the foundation of his support for the Accords. To Tony, signing was not an act of submission to governments he trusted only partially, but an admission that heroes could not be the sole judges of their own actions anymore. He understood that the Avengers had become a global force whose decisions affected millions, and that operating without oversight was no longer sustainable in a world that had seen cities lifted into the sky and dropped back down again. Tony's support for regulation was rooted in humility, not fear of control. He believed that submitting to an external authority, even an imperfect one, was preferable to continuing under the illusion that personal judgment was enough. This was not an easy position for him to take. It cost him friendships, trust, and the sense of belonging he had only recently begun to feel. After years of isolation, Tony was painfully aware that by signing the Accords he would be seen as the one who compromised, the one who chose structure over idealism. But he accepted that role because he believed someone had to. He saw the alternative clearly. Resistance would escalate tensions, provoke governments, and turn the Avengers into fugitives, eroding whatever goodwill remained and making future cooperation impossible. Steve's refusal felt to Tony like denial, not courage, a refusal to acknowledge how much damage they had already caused simply by existing as they were. Where Steve trusted his moral compass, Tony no longer trusted his own instincts without constraints, because he had seen what happened when those instincts went unchecked. This difference was not about who cared more, but about how they processed responsibility. Tony carried it inward, letting it reshape his choices even when it hurt. Steve carried it outward, believing that standing firm against authority was the truest expression of duty. The tragedy was that Tony did not believe the Accords would solve everything. He believed they would buy time, reduce harm, and keep the Avengers from tearing themselves apart under external pressure. His willingness to sign was a calculated sacrifice, one he made knowing it would place him on the opposite side of people he loved, because in his mind, preventing a larger conflict justified the personal cost. Tony Stark did not support the Accords because he thought they were just. He supported them because he thought they were necessary, and because he could no longer bear the thought of another disaster bearing his fingerprints. Responsibility, for Tony, meant accepting limits, accepting judgment, and accepting blame, even when doing so made him look weak or wrong. And in choosing that path, he set himself on a collision course with Steve Rogers, not as enemies driven by hatred, but as friends divided by the same desire to protect the world, interpreted through fundamentally different understandings of what responsibility truly meant. Chapter 6: Steve Rogers and the Weight of Freedom. For Steve Rogers, freedom was never an abstract political concept or a convenient slogan. It was the core of his identity, forged in an era when obedience had cost millions of lives, and when institutions had proven capable of becoming instruments of horror almost overnight. And by the time the Sokovia Accords were introduced, Steve's resistance wasn't born from stubbornness or arrogance, but from a deep, almost instinctive fear of repeating history. Steve came from a world where orders were followed without question, where symbols were used to justify atrocities, and where good men were asked to look away in the name of stability. His entire life had been shaped by the belief that moral responsibility could not be outsourced, that doing the right thing sometimes meant standing alone against authority rather than aligning with it. The collapse of SHIELD under Hydra's infiltration had only reinforced that conviction. leaving Steve with the unshakable sense that systems, no matter how well-intentioned, were always vulnerable to corruption, manipulation, and political convenience. When he looked at the Sokovia Accords, he did not see accountability. He saw delay, compromise, and the risk that the Avengers would be forced to sit idle while people suffered, because intervention was deemed inconvenient or politically costly. To Steve, the idea that a committee could decide who deserved saving and who did not felt fundamentally wrong, a betrayal of the very reason the Avengers existed in the first place. His opposition was not rooted in a desire for power, but in a refusal to surrender moral agency to institutions he did not trust, especially after witnessing firsthand how easily those institutions could be weaponized. Steve's worldview was shaped by immediacy. When danger appeared, action mattered more than permission, and hesitation could mean death. This perspective made him deeply uncomfortable with the idea of oversight, not because he rejected accountability in principle, but because he feared the consequences of hesitation imposed from the outside. Where Tony saw the Accords as a shield against chaos, Steve saw them as a leash that could be pulled at the worst possible moment. His distrust was compounded by personal experience. Every time Steve had placed his faith in an organization, it had eventually betrayed its stated values, and he was unwilling to gamble innocent lives on the hope that this time would be different. Steve also carried a quieter burden, the sense that the world he woke up into was already fragile, already divided, and already searching for someone to blame. He feared that by signing the Accords, the Avengers would legitimize a narrative that painted them as weapons rather than protectors, accelerating the erosion of public trust instead of restoring it. Unlike Tony, who internalized guilt and sought structure as a form of penance, Steve externalized responsibility, believing that his duty was to remain free to act according to conscience, regardless of how that choice was perceived. This difference in processing responsibility created a widening gap between them, not because one cared more than the other, but because they feared different outcomes. Steve feared a world where heroes were paralyzed by bureaucracy while atrocities unfolded unchecked. Tony feared a world where heroes operated without restraint until fear turned governments against them. For Steve, the Accords represented the normalization of fear-driven policy, a response crafted in the aftermath of tragedy rather than through careful moral reflection. He believed that signing away autonomy would set a precedent that could not be undone, gradually transforming the Avengers into instruments of state power rather than independent defenders of humanity. This belief was reinforced by his loyalty to individuals over institutions, particularly to Bucky Barnes, whose persecution he saw as proof that systems preferred convenient scapegoats to uncomfortable truths. Steve's stance was not without cost. It isolated him from allies, placed him in opposition to Tony, and positioned him as a dissenter at a moment when unity was desperately needed. Yet, he accepted that isolation because, in his mind, compromising on freedom was a step too far. A line that once crossed could not be reclaimed. Steve Rogers did not reject the Accords because he believed himself above the law. He rejected them because he believed that morality could not be legislated without losing its essence. His refusal was an act of faith in individual judgment over collective control, a conviction shaped by war, betrayal, and loss. And in carrying the weight of freedom on his shoulders, Steve unknowingly became the counterbalance to Tony's burden of responsibility, setting the stage for a conflict where neither man was wrong in intent, but where their irreconcilable fears would tear the Avengers apart from the inside. Chapter 7: Bucky Barnes, the Ghost of a War That Never Ended. Bucky Barnes entered the story of Civil War not as a villain, nor truly as a hero, but as a wound that history refused to let heal. A living reminder that wars do not end when treaties are signed or battles are won, but linger on in broken bodies and fractured minds. And for Steve Rogers, Bucky was never just a friend from the past. He was proof that loyalty, memory, and identity could survive even the most brutal attempts at erasure. Presumed dead after falling from a train during World War II, Bucky was reborn by Hydra as the Winter Soldier, stripped of autonomy, frozen between missions, and programmed to kill with mechanical precision, his humanity buried beneath layers of conditioning, violence, and chemical control. By the time the world rediscovered him, he had already left a trail of assassinations across decades, acts committed not by choice but by coercion, yet indistinguishable to the victims from a deliberate murder. For governments and intelligence agencies, Bucky Barnes was a liability, a dangerous asset that needed to be neutralized. For the public, he was a faceless symbol of terror caught on grainy surveillance footage. But for Steve, he was still the kid from Brooklyn, who had jumped on a grenade without hesitation, the friend who had once defined his understanding of courage and sacrifice. When the bombing at the Vienna International Center killed King T'Chaka of Wakanda and the Winter Soldier was framed as the culprit, the fragile equilibrium surrounding the Sokovia Accords shattered instantly. Fear demanded action, and action demanded a target, and Bucky Barnes became the perfect one. The urgency to apprehend him bypassed nuance and investigation, replacing complexity with certainty. Because in a world already afraid of enhanced individuals, the idea of a brainwashed assassin operating beyond borders confirmed every fear the Accords were meant to address. Steve's decision to protect Bucky was not a rejection of justice, but a rejection of simplification. He understood that punishing Bucky without acknowledging the years of manipulation he had endured would be another form of injustice, another instance of a system choosing expedience over truth. This placed Steve in direct conflict with Tony, not because Tony lacked empathy, but because Tony viewed the situation through the lens of containment and escalation. To Tony, Bucky represented a variable too dangerous to leave uncontrolled, a threat that could ignite international retaliation if mishandled. To Steve, Bucky represented the moral cost of a world too willing to discard individuals once they became inconvenient. The manhunt that followed exposed the fault lines beneath the Avengers debate, turning philosophical disagreement into immediate action. Steve's refusal to hand Bucky over without answers was interpreted as defiance, his loyalty framed as obstruction, and his faith in individual judgment cast as recklessness. Yet, beneath that narrative lay a quieter truth. Steve was trying to save the Avengers from repeating the same mistake that had created the Winter Soldier in the first place, the belief that ends justify means. Bucky himself existed in a state of constant terror, his memories fragmented, his sense of self unstable, aware of the crimes he had committed but unable to reconcile them with the person he once was. He did not run to escape justice, he ran to escape becoming a weapon again. Wakanda's involvement transformed the situation further, introducing T'Challa as a man driven by grief and the desire for vengeance, convinced that killing the Winter Soldier would restore balance. In that pursuit, T'Challa mirrored the world's instinctive response to trauma: find the source, eliminate it, and believe the pain will end. But as events unfolded, it became clear that Bucky was not the architect of the chaos surrounding him. He was its casualty. Zemo's manipulation of events, designed to fracture the Avengers from within, relied entirely on the existence of Bucky as a symbol of unresolved history, a lever capable of turning personal loyalty into global conflict. Bucky's presence forced every character to confront uncomfortable questions. Can someone be held fully accountable for actions committed under absolute coercion? Does justice without context become cruelty? And how far should loyalty extend when the cost is global instability? For Steve, the answer was unwavering: protect the individual, seek the truth, and refuse to let fear dictate morality. For Tony, the answer was cautious: contain the threat, prevent escalation, and accept that some personal sacrifices are necessary to preserve the greater good. Neither approach was born of malice, but Bucky's existence made compromise impossible. He was a ghost of a war that never truly ended, a reminder that the past, when ignored, does not fade, it returns sharper and more destructive than before. By centering the conflict on Bucky Barnes, Civil War transformed from a debate about laws into a tragedy about people, exposing how easily fear can override compassion and how loyalty, when misunderstood, can be weaponized. Bucky was not the cause of the Avengers' collapse, but he was the catalyst that revealed how fragile their unity had already become. In trying to save one broken man, Steve unknowingly accelerated the fall of a team that had once saved the world together, proving that unresolved history has a way of demanding payment, no matter how much time has passed. Chapter 8: The Avengers Split. The split of the Avengers did not happen in a single argument or a single act of defiance. It unfolded gradually, like a structure collapsing under stress it had been carrying for far too long, each disagreement adding pressure until unity became impossible to sustain. By the time Steve chose to go underground with Bucky and Tony chose to enforce the Accords, the team was no longer divided by paperwork or ideology alone, but by trust that had begun to erode quietly after Sokovia and shattered openly after Lagos. Every interaction carried a double meaning. Every conversation felt like a negotiation rather than a dialogue, and the shared language of teamwork that had once defined the Avengers was replaced by careful restraint and unspoken suspicion. Steve's refusal to comply with the Accords was interpreted not merely as dissent, but as a personal rejection of the team's collective decision, while Tony's willingness to sign was seen by others as a betrayal of the independence that had once made the Avengers effective. Natasha Romanoff stood at the center of this fracture, attempting to balance pragmatism with loyalty, recognizing the dangers on both sides but increasingly aware that compromise was slipping out of reach. Vision's logical assessment that the Avengers' existence increased global instability further alienated those who believed heroism could not be reduced to probability and data, deepening the emotional divide. Wanda Maximoff, already burdened by guilt and fear, found herself confined and monitored for her own protection, a decision that reinforced Steve's belief that oversight would inevitably become control, while also confirming Tony's fear that unregulated power invited backlash. As tensions escalated, the Avengers compound transformed from a home into a holding space, a place where silence replaced camaraderie, and where shared meals were replaced by guarded glances. The arrival of T'Challa as Black Panther, driven by grief and a desire for justice, added another layer of complexity, as personal vengeance intersected with international law, blurring the line between accountability and retribution. The manhunt for Bucky forced every Avenger to choose where they stood, not as heroes, but as individuals answering to their own conscience. Steve's decision to protect Bucky, even at the cost of becoming a fugitive, was the moment when disagreement hardened into separation. It was no longer possible to pretend the team could function as it once had. Tony's response to assemble those willing to enforce the Accords was not motivated by anger towards Steve, but by a belief that allowing defiance to go unchecked would accelerate the collapse of what little trust the world still had in the Avengers. This was the tragedy at the heart of the split. Both men believed they were preventing something worse. Steve feared the loss of moral agency. Tony feared the loss of legitimacy. Neither could yield without betraying the principles that defined them. The involvement of younger heroes like Peter Parker and Scott Lang highlighted the generational shift within the team, exposing how differently responsibility and freedom were understood depending on experience and context. Peter's eagerness to help, guided by Tony's mentorship, contrasted sharply with Steve's insistence that people should not be asked to fight battles shaped by politics they did not fully understand. As preparations were made for confrontation, the Avengers ceased to be a unified symbol of protection and became a collection of individuals aligned by belief rather than allegiance. The emotional cost of this transformation was profound, particularly for those who remembered what it felt like to stand together against impossible odds. The knowledge that they might soon face one another in combat was not thrilling or righteous. It was deeply unsettling, a betrayal of everything they had built together. The split revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Avengers had always been held together by circumstance rather than consensus, and once that circumstance changed, their unity proved fragile. What emerged in its place was not a clear line between right and wrong, but a landscape of competing fears, loyalties, and convictions. The Avengers did not fall apart because they stopped caring about the world. They fell apart because they cared in incompatible ways. In choosing their sides, they did not abandon heroism, but redefined it according to personal truth, setting the stage for a confrontation that would turn ideology into violence and transform friends into opponents. By the time they boarded separate planes toward the same destination, the Avengers were no longer a team divided by debate. They were a family already broken, moving inexorably toward a conflict neither side truly wanted, but neither side could avoid. Chapter 9: Team Iron Man vs. Team Cap. The confrontation at the Leipzig Halle airport was never meant to be a battle in the traditional sense. It was not a clash born of hatred or conquest, but a collision of convictions carried by people who once trusted each other with their lives, and that truth lingered in every glance, every hesitation, every moment where words failed and movement took over. As the two sides assembled on opposite ends of the tarmac, the scale of what was about to happen felt surreal. Heroes who had stood shoulder to shoulder against alien invasions and world-ending threats now facing one another under a gray sky, surrounded by concrete and steel, with no civilians to save and no villains to defeat, only each other. Tony Stark arrived with the weight of the Accords behind him, flanked by allies who believed that enforcing the law, however imperfect, was the only way to prevent the Avengers from being torn apart by the world's fear. Steve Rogers stood opposite him, resolute and silent, protecting Bucky and the belief that surrendering autonomy would lead to consequences far worse than any immediate conflict. The exchange between them was restrained, almost painfully polite, as if both men were still searching for a final sentence that might undo what had already begun. But the moment passed, and with it, the last opportunity for reconciliation. When the fighting started, it was chaotic yet strangely restrained, a dance of power where no one truly wanted to land a fatal blow. Steve fought with the efficiency of a soldier trained to disable rather than destroy, his shield moving with precision and purpose, while Tony relied on technology and adaptability, his armor responding in real time to threats he had never imagined facing from his own friends. Around them, the battle unfolded in fragments of loyalty and doubt. Natasha Romanoff switching sides in a moment of quiet defiance, choosing conscience over command. Wanda Maximoff unleashing power she barely trusted herself to control. Vision hesitating at crucial moments, torn between logic and emotion. And Peter Parker, young and overwhelmed, treating the fight like a strange, terrifying game he did not fully understand. Scott Lang's humor barely masked his confusion, while Sam Wilson and Clint Barton fought with the grim familiarity of people who knew exactly how dangerous the others could be. The airport became a mosaic of individual conflicts, each reflecting the broader ideological divide in a more personal form. What made the battle tragic was not its scale, but its restraint. Blows were pulled, strategies were improvised to avoid permanent harm, and even in the heat of combat the fighters hesitated when confronted with the reality of who they were fighting. Tony's reliance on containment over destruction was evident in his efforts to incapacitate rather than eliminate, a reflection of his desire to end the conflict without irreversible damage, while Steve's tactics focused on creating openings and escape routes rather than outright victory. The introduction of new heroes like Spider-Man and Black Panther underscored how far the conflict had drifted from its origins, drawing in individuals who barely understood the history that had led to this moment. T'Challa's pursuit of Bucky was driven by grief and a thirst for justice, his rage sharpened by the belief that killing the Winter Soldier would restore balance. Yet even he began to sense that the truth was more complicated than vengeance allowed. As the fight escalated, the emotional cost became impossible to ignore. Every collision of shield and armor echoed with memories of past victories. Every fall felt heavier because it was inflicted by someone who once would have caught them. When Rhodey was gravely injured by Vision's miscalculated blast, the illusion that this conflict could remain harmless shattered completely. The sound of his fall, the sudden stillness that followed, and the realization that permanent consequences had finally arrived froze the battlefield in a moment of collective horror. For Tony, Rhodey's injury was confirmation of his worst fears, that unchecked power, even among allies, could spiral out of control and destroy lives. For Steve, it was a devastating reminder that even principled resistance carried costs he could not fully anticipate. The battle ended not with victory, but with exhaustion and grief, as Team Cap escaped and Team Iron Man was left to reckon with the aftermath. There was no triumph in stopping a Quinjet or arresting former friends, only the hollow realization that something essential had been lost. The airport fight did not resolve the debate that caused it, it entrenched it. It transformed ideological disagreement into physical trauma and made reconciliation exponentially harder. In that cold, open space between terminals, the Avengers crossed a line they could never uncross, proving that once belief hardens into action, even the strongest bonds can fracture under the weight of conviction. The airport was not a battlefield in the traditional sense, it was a breaking point, where the Avengers stopped pretending they were one team and accepted, consciously or not, that the path forward would be walked apart. Chapter 10. Zemo's plan unfolds. Helmut Zemo never sought power, glory, or dominion over others. His weapon was patience and his battlefield was the human heart. And in a world obsessed with gods and monsters, that made him uniquely dangerous. Where others tried to defeat the Avengers by force, Zemo understood something far more unsettling. They did not need to be beaten, only divided. His plan did not begin with violence but with grief, the quiet, corrosive grief of a man who had lost his family in the Battle of Sokovia, crushed beneath rubble that fell from a war fought high above them by people who would never know their names. Zemo did not see heroes when he looked at the Avengers. He saw a system that allowed unimaginable power to operate without consequence, and rather than confronting that power head-on, he chose to dismantle it from the inside. He studied them meticulously, not as warriors, but as people, identifying fault lines formed by guilt, loyalty, and unresolved trauma, and he realized that the Avengers' greatest strength, their bond, was also their most fragile vulnerability. By framing Bucky Barnes for the bombing in Vienna, Zemo set the world in motion without ever appearing on its stage, exploiting the existing tensions surrounding the Sokovia Accords and the global fear of enhanced individuals. His manipulation was precise. He ensured that evidence would point convincingly toward the Winter Soldier, knowing that Steve Rogers would respond with absolute loyalty, that Tony Stark would respond with urgency and containment, and that the resulting conflict would deepen the rift between them beyond repair. Zemo did not rush, he allowed events to unfold naturally, trusting that the Avengers would do most of the work for him. While governments scrambled, heroes argued, and alliances fractured, Zemo moved quietly through the margins, gathering the final pieces he needed to complete his design. His objective was never to release an army of winter soldiers. He had already determined that they were unnecessary. Strength was irrelevant when emotional collapse could achieve the same end. When Zemo finally reached the Siberian Hydra facility, it was not to unleash chaos, but to close a chapter, executing the dormant soldiers with cold efficiency, ensuring that no external threat would distract from the confrontation he was engineering. This act revealed the true nature of his plan. He was not interested in escalation, only in exposure. Zemo understood that the Avengers would inevitably follow him, drawn by the belief that a greater danger awaited, and in doing so, he guided Steve and Tony toward the moment he had been preparing since Sokovia, the revelation that would turn ideological division into personal devastation. His final move was not an attack, but a confession, delivered through carefully preserved footage that revealed the truth about the deaths of Howard and Maria Stark, murdered by Bucky Barnes while under Hydra's control. Zemo did not present this information with malice or triumph. He presented it with calm inevitability, fully aware that truth, once seen, could not be unseen. He did not need to argue or persuade. The emotional weight of the revelation would do the work for him. Tony's reaction was immediate and visceral, the accumulated guilt, anger, and grief erupting in a moment that logic could no longer restrain. Steve's silence was just as devastating because it confirmed what Tony already sensed, that this truth had been known and withheld, protected by loyalty at the cost of honesty. Zemo watched as the Avengers' internal conflict reached its breaking point, his expression not one of victory but of quiet resignation, as though he had simply completed a task that sorrow demanded of him. In that moment, Zemo achieved what no army, no alien invasion, no artificial intelligence ever had. He broke the Avengers by forcing them to confront the consequences of their own history. His success lay not in destruction, but in revelation, in proving that power does not protect against pain, and that even heroes are vulnerable to the same human fractures as everyone else. Zemo's plan unfolded without spectacle, without grand speeches or world-ending stakes, yet its impact was profound and irreversible. He exposed the Avengers to themselves, stripping away ideology and law until only raw emotion remained, and in doing so, he ensured that the team would never fully recover. Zemo did not defeat the Avengers in battle. He outlived them in memory, leaving behind a truth that would echo through every conflict that followed. His plan succeeded because it did not rely on chance or strength, but on an intimate understanding of loss, proving that the most devastating wars are not fought with weapons, but with the careful placement of truth at exactly the moment it hurts the most. Chapter 11: Siberia. The truth that destroys everything. The Hydra facility in Siberia was never meant to be a battlefield. It was a mausoleum, a frozen archive of crimes buried beneath layers of snow and secrecy. And as Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, and Bucky Barnes descended into its cold, echoing halls, the air itself seemed heavy with the past waiting to be unearthed. Zemo led them there not to fight, but to witness, to stand still in the presence of a truth that had been preserved with surgical precision, waiting for the exact moment when it could no longer be deflected or denied. The revelation came without drama or build-up, just flickering footage projected onto a concrete wall. Howard Stark stepping out of his car, speaking softly to his wife, unaware that history had already chosen its path, and then the Winter Soldier emerging from the shadows, mechanical arm gleaming, eyes empty, executing his orders with brutal efficiency. The murder unfolded in silence, intimate and horrifying, stripping away decades of distance in a matter of seconds. For Tony, time collapsed. The man who had spent his life wrestling with the legacy of his father, resentment, admiration, unresolved longing, was suddenly forced to confront the raw finality of that loss. not as a historical fact, but as a living wound torn open in real time. His reaction was not calculated or philosophical, it was instinctive, a surge of grief and rage colliding in a way that bypassed reason entirely. In that moment, Tony did not see a brainwashed victim or a manipulated soldier. He saw the face of the man who had ended his parents' lives. Steve's silence was devastating in its own way, because it carried confirmation. Tony did not need an explanation. He understood immediately that Steve had known, that he had chosen loyalty over disclosure, protection over honesty, and that betrayal cut deeper than the footage itself. Steve's defense that Bucky had not been in control, that Hydra was responsible, rang hollow against the emotional weight of what Tony had just witnessed. To Tony, this was not about moral nuance or historical context. It was about the unbearable realization that the truth had been kept from him by someone he trusted completely. Bucky stood frozen between them, caught in a moment that reduced him to both victim and executioner, burdened by memories he did not choose but could not escape. His whispered apology carried no expectation of forgiveness, only acknowledgement, a recognition that some wounds are too deep to be healed by explanation. Zemo, having delivered the final piece of his plan, faded into irrelevance, his presence no longer necessary now that the truth had done its work. The conflict that followed was raw and deeply personal, stripped of ideology, politics, and grand narratives. Tony attacked not as Iron Man the Avenger, but as a son who had just lost his parents all over again. Steve defended Bucky not as Captain America the symbol, but as a man protecting the last connection to his past. Their fight was brutal and intimate, every blow infused with years of unspoken tension, every clash of shield and armor echoing with the knowledge that this was no longer about right or wrong, but about pain that could not be reasoned away. Tony's technology adapted relentlessly, analyzing Steve's movements, calculating countermeasures, reflecting his need for control in a moment when everything felt uncontrollable. Steve fought with desperation, not to win, but to survive and to protect, driven by loyalty that had already cost him everything else. The facility itself seemed to crumble under the intensity of the confrontation, metal screeching, concrete cracking, as if the structure could not contain the weight of what was unfolding within it. When Tony incapacitated Bucky and turned fully on Steve, the final fracture became complete. The shield that once symbolized unity became a weapon against the man who had forged that unity in the first place. And when Steve finally dropped the shield and walked away, leaving it behind as an act of resignation rather than defeat, the symbolism was unmistakable. The Avengers were over. There was no victory in Siberia, only loss. Tony was left alone in the ruins, surrounded by broken machines and shattered trust, the echo of his parents' final moments still ringing in his mind. Steve and Bucky escaped, not as heroes, but as fugitives carrying the weight of choices that had closed every door behind them. Siberia was the moment when Civil War stopped being a debate and became a scar, a place where truth did not bring resolution, but devastation, where honesty arrived too late to heal, and only in time to destroy. It proved that even the strongest bonds could not survive unspoken truths indefinitely, and that some revelations, once revealed, do not clarify the past, they consume it. In that frozen wasteland, the Avengers did not just fall apart, they were unmade, reduced to individuals separated by grief, loyalty, and the irreversible consequences of silence. Chapter 12: The Fall of the Avengers. After Siberia, the Avengers did not end with a declaration or a public announcement. They ended the way many real things end, quietly, painfully, through absence, through silence, through the slow realization that what once held them together could not be rebuilt in the same form. The world outside did not fully understand what had happened in that frozen facility, did not see the footage that shattered Tony Stark. did not feel the weight of Steve Rogers walking away and leaving his shield behind, but it felt the consequences immediately. The Avengers, once a symbol of global protection, were now fractured, diminished, and politically radioactive. Tony returned to a life that looked intact from the outside: resources, authority, official sanction, but felt hollow from within, because the thing he had truly lost was not simply a fight, but faith. Faith that his team could survive its own history. Faith that compromise would protect what mattered. Faith that being responsible would keep the world from tearing them apart. He had chosen the Accords believing he was preventing the worst outcome, and yet the worst outcome arrived anyway, only dressed in different colors, not as global war, but as personal ruin. Steve, meanwhile, vanished into the margins, no longer Captain America in the eyes of the state, but a fugitive operating according to conscience, leading with loyalty instead of legitimacy. The act of leaving the shield was not just symbolic, it was surrendering the title, the identity the world had placed upon him, because he could no longer wear it under terms he did not believe in. The Avengers compound, once a place of shared purpose and reluctant family, became an echo chamber, its halls too wide, its rooms too quiet, filled with the remnants of a team that had once moved like a single organism. Those who remained under the Accords tried to continue the mission, but the mission itself had changed. Without Steve's leadership, without the trust that made coordination instinctive, the Avengers became less a family and more an institution. And institutions, even well-meaning ones, move slower, speak softer, and bleed their humanity into paperwork. The individuals caught in the middle suffered the most. Wanda Maximoff, already fragile, found her world narrowing, her identity reduced to risk assessments and containment protocols. Vision, logical yet increasingly aware of emotion, carried the quiet burden of knowing his calculations had been correct while still feeling the discomfort of what correctness had cost. Natasha Romanoff, whose life had always been a series of compromises, watched the team fracture and understood that this was the price of living in a world where loyalty and survival rarely align. And somewhere far from public attention, Steve and Bucky moved through safe houses and shadows, choosing exile over submission, not because they wanted to abandon the world, but because they believed the world's systems had already abandoned the principles that once justified obedience. The most devastating consequence of the Avengers' fall, however, wasn't emotional, it was strategic. The team had been Earth's first line of defense against threats that did not respect borders or laws, threats that arrived from the sky, from other dimensions, from the darkest edges of human ambition. With the Avengers fractured, the planet was quieter, but also more vulnerable. The lesson of Civil War was not that heroes should be regulated or freed. It was that division invites disaster. Zemo had understood that perfectly. He had not needed to kill them. He had only needed to separate them until they could no longer stand together when the next storm arrived. The irony was cruel. The Accords were meant to reassure the world, yet the world's reassurance came at the cost of its greatest protection. Steve's side, operating in secret, could still save lives, but without legitimacy they would always be hunted, always forced to choose between remaining hidden and acting openly. Tony's side, operating under sanction, could still respond to threats, but with constraints that made rapid intervention complicated, and with trust damaged by the knowledge that even sanctioned heroes could be politically weaponized. The Avengers, in their original form, had been messy, chaotic, imperfect, and yet uniquely effective because they were bound by trust rather than law. Once that trust collapsed, no legal framework could replace it. In the public narrative, Civil War ended with arrests and agreements, with the idea that order had been restored. But in truth, it ended with an absence that could be felt everywhere. The absence of unity, the absence of certainty, the absence of the simple comfort that someone would be there when the sky opened again. The fall of the Avengers was not a single event, but a condition, a new reality in which heroes existed as individuals rather than a collective, where alliances were temporary and fragile, and where the world, despite thinking it had solved a problem, had actually created a vacuum. In that vacuum, grief lingered, guilt hardened, and trust became a currency no one could afford. The Avengers had once been the answer to a world in crisis. After Siberia, they became proof that even the greatest answers can fracture under the weight of human pain, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one who attacks from the outside, but the one who succeeds in making you fight yourself. Chapter 13: Aftermath: A Universe Forever Changed. The aftermath of Civil War did not announce itself with explosions or headlines. It unfolded quietly, invisibly, in the spaces where unity used to exist, reshaping the Marvel Cinematic Universe not through spectacle but through absence. And by the time the next great threat arrived, the damage had already been done. The world believed order had been restored. The Sokovia Accords were in place, enhanced individuals were monitored, and the chaos of unchecked heroism appeared contained. Yet beneath that surface calm lay a fragile reality in which Earth's greatest defenders were scattered, mistrustful, and emotionally fractured. Tony Stark continued to operate within the system, carrying the burden of responsibility heavier than ever, trying to maintain something resembling protection, while knowing deep down that the team he once relied on no longer existed as a cohesive force. His conversations with Steve became letters instead of arguments, words delayed by distance and regret, and when he chose not to reveal Steve's message until the moment of greatest need, it reflected a man still torn between anger and longing for reconciliation. Steve Rogers, operating outside the law, became a symbol of quiet resistance, helping where he could without recognition or legitimacy, guided by conscience rather than command, his faith in people intact even as his faith in institutions remained broken. The Avengers' fracture left consequences that reached far beyond personal relationships. When Thanos began to move openly, when the Infinity Stones shifted from rumor to imminent threat, the planet faced the unthinkable without the unified front that had once stood against Loki and Ultron. The Avengers were not ready, not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked trust. Infinity War exposed this weakness brutally, showing how separation, delayed coordination, and unresolved tension allowed catastrophe to unfold. Tony and Steve fought on opposite sides of the galaxy, each carrying the same goal but unable to stand together when it mattered most, and the price of that division was written into the fabric of reality itself. The snap was not caused by the Avengers' division, but their division ensured it could not be stopped. And in that sense, Civil War did not end in Siberia or with the signing of the Accords. It echoed forward, shaping every loss that followed. The survivors carried that knowledge with them, consciously or not. Natasha Romanoff would later try to rebuild what was lost, forming a loose network of heroes bound not by law or ideology, but by shared grief and the understanding that division had already cost them half the universe. Her sacrifice was born from that lesson, a final attempt to restore balance where politics had failed. Wanda Maximoff's grief deepened into isolation, her power untethered by the absence of guidance and trust, setting her on a path shaped by loss rather than belonging. Vision's death, occurring without the protection of a unified team, underscored how vulnerable even the most powerful beings became when standing alone. And when the Avengers finally reunited in Endgame, it was not as they once were. They came together older, quieter, scarred by failure, driven less by confidence and more by necessity. The unity they found was fragile and hard-won, forged not through shared ideals but through shared loss. Tony's final sacrifice closed the arc that Civil War had begun. A man who once feared unchecked power choosing instead to give everything, not to control the future, but to allow it to exist at all. Steve's decision to step away from the mantle, to live a life rather than symbolize one, reflected a man finally at peace with the cost of standing apart. Civil War reshaped the MCU by proving that heroes do not need to be defeated to be undone. They only need to stop trusting one another. It revealed that ideology, when allowed to override empathy, can fracture even the strongest alliances, and that accountability without trust becomes hollow, just as freedom without unity becomes dangerous. The universe that emerged from Civil War was more cautious, more fragmented, and more vulnerable, a place where heroism came with consequences that could not be erased by victory alone. And yet, within that broken landscape something enduring remained, the understanding that disagreement does not negate intention, that people can be right for different reasons, and still cause irreversible harm. Civil War did not offer simple answers. It left scars, lessons, and unresolved questions that continued to shape every choice that followed. In doing so, it transformed the MCU from a story about heroes saving the world into a meditation on what happens after they succeed, when power lingers, trust erodes, and the hardest battles are no longer against enemies in the sky, but against the fractures within ourselves. The universe moved forward changed, not because heroes failed to fight, but because they learned, too late, that standing together mattered just as much as standing for something. And that's where we'll stop for tonight. Thank you for staying here with me and for listening. I hope this helped you relax or maybe drift off a little. This was Sleepy Marvel, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.